Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Denyse Davis. As you know, I'm Mark's executive assistant. I'm Wendy for Coventry, and I'm also director of research for SNS's initiative of Flow and Interaction. Today, I have the honor of being on stage for the first time at FiRe, and I get to interview Mark, you all know, and then Paul Sallomi, who is, I'm going to try and get this right, Vice Chairman and U.S. and Global Technology Sector Leader and Global TMT Leader for Deloitte LLP. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, and I have to add, he's a big believer in what we're going to talk about today. We've had several conversations with him, and he's been very excited about it. But we're switching things up a little bit today. We're not doing 30 minutes of talking here. We're doing 15 minutes here, and then we're turning it over to our audience. This is going to be the most interactive FiRe panel we've ever had. So we're going to set the stage for flow and interaction, and then we welcome you guys to come up to the mics and ask questions, give us ideas. This is a group discussion about the applications and potentials for F&I. So Mark, let's go ahead and start this, set the stage. What is the history of flow and interaction to you?
So a lot of folks were at FiRe last year.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them weren't. We backed into this whole thing in terms as a group in the creation of FiRe when it had the theme of the power of flows. And I backed into this as an individual over about 30 years, trying to figure out why this thing called chaos mathematics or complexity mathematics worked. Essentially, there was a math that could tell you when the drop would come out of a rusty faucet. And why did that work? It also described everything in nature. And so over the 30 years, I'm kind of trying to bubble this up and not getting very far. And I knew that flows were involved somehow, drops of flow. And then it didn't get very far. And then, as you know, Denyse, we ran into this crazy guy who's here, Murray Cantor, who's a brilliant mathematician, scientist, tech guy, IBM fellow, and so forth. And Murray gave a speech that night, and you and I were at the UNDX launch, and he was talking about the Lorentz attractor, and he showed complexity mathematics, three main equations for the Lorentz attractor, and the light bulb went on. And I said, Murray, is it possible that that series of mathematics, of those equations, describes flow and resistance? And he said, absolutely. You were there. It took about 8 seconds, or 2 seconds.
2 seconds, yeah.
And so there was like, oh my goodness, this is interesting. So suddenly we're going beyond flow to something bigger. And then we had a wonderful talk with Murray. And he said, but Mark, you're wrong about the second part. And he showed us the math again. He said, it's not resistance, that's just a subset. We call this flow and coupling. And I said, Murray, we can't use the word coupling because it sounds like rabbits mating, so let's call it something else. Let's call it interactions. He said, that's fine. So flow and interaction was born. And then at the same time, we had a little meeting with Brad, who's an expert on the mathematics of all this, and Mike Riddle, and both of whom have electrical engineering backgrounds. And we got into this fairly heated discussion about, is it flow and resistance? Are there capacitors there and somehow? So all this is bubbling around. And then Murray kind of put the cap on it and said, those two things are both interaction, relax. And at that point, we're about 2 weeks from FiRe. And we tell everybody who's going to talk, if this fits for you, only if it fits, please try to talk about this in terms of flow and interaction. And then FiRe happened. So we had Murray on stage, and then I'll shut up. And Murray said, in that moment, we were being interviewed, I was interviewed, and Murray said, I said, does this apply to everything? He said, everything. He said, is this universal? I said, Mark, seriously, it's everything in the universe.
Now, did you realize how big of an idea this F&I would be when you came into FiRe? Did you have any clue how it would take off?
No, I didn't. It was just starting to feel like that at FiRe, you know? And one thing that happened, and the reason that Denyse is leading this discussion is that after FiRe was blown out, we're all tired, kind of forget, go on vacation, come back, start the next thing. I was in that mode, and I was doing the next 2 or 3 things. And one day Denyse goes, wait, what about flow and interaction? I thought you said that was important. And I thought, oh yeah, it is important. So we like back up the truck, start again. And she was the person who did that. And also we thought, let's create a book. And so Denyse took that project on her own and created the very first book on this subject. So we really do believe not kidding, what we said then, we're saying it now, a year later. We really do believe that flow and interaction are the universal drivers behind everything in the universe. And this book is the first book ever done on that subject. And it is basically a transcription of those people, including Paul, who spoke last year on this subject. So it's no more, no less, but it is right now the Bible on flow and interaction. So if you want to learn about it, this is it. Denyse compiled it, and we just published it about a month ago. Right. And now it's available outside at where Meg Weber is selling FiRe books.
So Mark, what else has gone on since FiRe for us? Can you give them an idea?
We have tried to evangelize this, and we have evangelized this. So we've talked to Deloitte. They were kind enough to invite us out to Colorado Springs, and we've talked to Accenture Labs. Eddie's here. We spent an afternoon with that team. We went to the Dent conference. Jason's probably here. He's kind enough to invite us to Dent. And that was a kind of a magic moment, Jason. So Denyse, he gave us permission to have Denyse interview me because we had 8 minutes to tell the whole story of all 8. And we took him seriously, so we said, okay, let's do it we'll rehearse it, we'll do the interview. Denyse did the interview, I was there too, and we took 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And in the crowd was Curtis Wong, an old friend who works for Microsoft Research and is better known for being Bill Gates' personal assistant on the Codex Leicester by Leonardo. And we saw him at the wine thing for VIPs afterwards, and the very first thing we asked him, so what'd you think about the talk today? And without batting an eye, he said, you've achieved what Leonardo aspired to. Holy. And I thought, I better go read that Codex Leicester again. So I did. And Leonardo spent a large part of his life standing on bridges looking at water and looking for the meaning of the flows and the eddies in the water and finding those fundamentals in other things in the world. There was a reason why Curtis said that. So I think that we actually did do that.
I think so.
Yeah.
So Paul, Mark set the stage. Now for you, how are the concepts of F&I relevant to corporations? You work for Deloitte. It's kind of a semi-large company, has a couple customers and corporations. What do you think?
Well, as you know, we're all about the enterprise.
Right.
And we think a lot about how technology is transforming what's possible in the enterprise environments. Technology used to be a lot about consumerism. And so, Mark, when you asked me that question last year, you did what you always do so well, which is, number one, make me think, and make me think deeply and differently about something I've been doing for 20, 25 years at that point in time. And what really struck me was how foundational, you talked about the river, how foundational just flows are in terms of enabling commerce. Whether they're natural flows like the rivers, and we talked about some of this in the book, and last year, for those who were here, natural flows like waterways or ocean currents or trade winds, or man-made flows like railroads, airplanes, the internet. All of these things are the foundations upon which commerce is built. And we find ourselves now at really an unprecedented moment in the history of commerce where the opportunity to make visible flows that were existing and then act on them, interact with those flows in a meaningful way is unprecedented, and it's at global scale. And we also have an unprecedented opportunity on the backbone of technology to create new flows. So it's a moment in time that I really think it will take longer than we think it might, but 20, 30 years from now, when people write about the first part of this century, all of these pieces are going to come together. And whether you're talking about things like the collaboration economy, I think a neat little example of that concept is your CTO challenge. Well, think about that happening in a more virtual world and also across enterprises. Companies are coming together to collaborate and work in new models and open talent models. And those types of changes, I think, I think people are going to look at the construct of flows and information flows and how digital era and the digital transformation created entirely new opportunities for the enterprise. So an example of a flow that always existed that is now visible is just think about people and people moving around all the time. And now with the fact that we carry our phones, we're tracked, basically. I mean, we know where people are at any given moment. We know how much time they spend in any given place. And that opens up a universe of opportunities for commercial opportunity and exploitation, right?
What are some of you brought up digital. Now, give me some examples of how digital is making new flows. Is there, the smart refrigerators or?
Yeah, well, then you get into the connected world,
Right.
right? And in this case, connected devices is creating everything that we've all talked about in terms of, smart asset tracking around global distributions or supply chains, to smart factories, to predictive maintenance. But it's changing things in a fundamental way that we didn't really anticipate. And we all talked about cloud and infrastructure as a service, but we're moving towards a world where almost any product in a connected world can be delivered as a service.
Right.
And that's starting to take hold. Things that you wouldn't think of, like printing, printing as a service, where no longer do you have to think about how much paper have I ordered. The paper just appears, right? My machines don't break down anymore. I pay for how much I print at my enterprise, and someone else is monitoring all of that stuff remotely. Or it's even as large, things as large as trains that are starting to be delivered on an as-a-service model. So you can see a fundamental shift to a really robust, at the enterprise level, service-based economy. And those types of activities are fundamentally different than selling products with a warranty where you interact with your customer if it breaks down or at the point of sale. It's a continual enterprise to enterprise or enterprise to consumer relationship based on constant flows.
And the flows, the old school flows were still there, but they were very slow or sluggish or had interactions that were negative.
Yeah.
And I think what you're describing is the increased efficiency or scale of these flows and how they interact with each other.
Right. Or some of them, without sensors, they weren't visible too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that drums up the whole idea of metrics, right? So I mean, one of the things we're excited about actually with Deloitte, we're not going to announce this, but we're having some conversations about how do you measure things. So could we measure these things in the corporate world in some way that would be helpful to managers?
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that the answer is going to be yes.
So we've talked about the flows, but now it's flow and interactions. And so we have, we've got to talk about the negative interactions inside and outside. But then, of course, Mark said we're an optimistic group, so we also need to talk about positive interactions as well. Can you give me one or two examples of positive and negative interactions that would happen with?
Well, starting with the negative, I think we got a heavy dose of that over the last few hours before the CTO challenge on some of the challenges.
Right.
To me, one of the most important ones is really around IP, and you talk a lot about theft nations. I think also we need to think about this at a much more granular level. If we think about a cooperative economy or a sharing economy and all the disruption that's happening in business models, how do we make sure that the incentives for creativity are still sustained in that type of environment? I love just the FiRe IP model. I think that's a creative solution where you give out shares for contributions. There are some historical models, but there's some already very serious examples of how this type of interaction with the digital era has really disrupted the creative community. Early out of the box was music, right?
Yeah.
Where the writers, the creators of music are really relying on the revenue that comes from the performance or the mechanical sales. And look what happened with streaming and file sharing. And so we're going to see, I think, a series of developments. FiRe IP, I think, is a cool one, they're going to have to follow to ensure that at the individual level, the creators that are going to enable all of this are properly rewarded. And,
Right.
Well, now,
Positive interaction.
now we
Yeah.
have some time to go ahead and have the audience. We'd love for you guys to come up, have questions, ideas, how we can get the F&I into everybody's industry and how it can better everybody's lives as well. While we have people walking up, I'm going to quickly ask Paul, what's the positive? What's the positive interaction?
I think the positive is that while to me, global commerce is not going to solve the big problems that we need to deal with, but it will be a great enabler. I think we will have an uplift in economic activity that will come from all of these tools and what we'll learn to do with them over the coming 30, 40, 50 years that will help us on the journey to solving the big problems that we're trying to deal with. So to me, that's the biggest positive, that commerce will play its part in helping us get there.
Denyse, so if flow and interaction underlie everything, and I understand why you talk about enterprises and why the impacts are so great, but what are some of the takeaways for individuals? If I'm a professional and you say to me, flow and interaction, that's everything. You got to understand that. What do I have to understand? What's actionable? What should I as a professional do or understand differently once you tell me flow and interaction?
Do you want to take this one?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One that's a personal fail I can share. People talk about flow states, and we don't really deal with flow states, in psychological states. Like athletes talk about flow states, and certainly coaches work on this stuff. So they're working on interactions and flows already. There's a famous bicycle team from, I think, Brazil that's already been working on this. And so there's clear applications in athletics and in team sports, things like that. But I think from a personal, professional perspective, think about it this way. You come up with an idea, and you're working on it, and someone interrupts you. Or in comes an email, ding, and suddenly you're answering some stupid email instead of staying on that subject. It's scientifically proven that if you interrupt someone constantly, they're not going to be as productive with that idea. And I would go further and say the great ideas that come up might not even happen if someone's constantly bothering you. So setting your own life up, or your own schedule up, or your own sound environment up, or your own interruptions scene up, your email scene up, so that you actually have personal time to have flow, to allow ideas to flow clearly from one to the other inside your own mind. And another example of the fail that I've still trying to figure out is you meet somebody at a FiRe conference and you have a great time. You meet Paul Sallomi and you have a great time. Let's do something together. And then what happens? You go home, you lose a business card, or you don't. And then something else, phone rings, email comes in, and then you don't do anything. And the flow of that relationship with that other person or that other company gets broken. And almost inevitably, that's a bad thing. So I don't have the right tools in terms of computer stuff to do that right. I mean, people have like sales, CRM. But in terms of not selling, but working together, how do I make sure that the relationship I have with you and you and you continues in the way it should continue, that it flows properly, that we have great interactions over months or years? I'm a fail on that one, and I try to do it, but I don't do a very good job. So I think for a single professional person, that one thing would probably bring in more joy than anything else. I wish I could tell you how to do it, but I don't know.
Paul, do you have something?
I do. Me personally, as a professional, I think one of the greatest flows that we now have is flows of knowledge and flows and networks and connectivity. And one of the things that I personally do is I have in social media a select list of VIPs that I stay connected to and follow, and I use that to understand what people are thinking about and to help me accelerate my own understanding and thinking and be broad and wide in my aperture in terms of the areas that I have personally selected that are important to my own personal development and the development of the practice that I support.
Yeah, I think someone who wants to make some money who's really bored right now should invent the tool I just described. It would be just like CRM, like customer relationship management, but not for customers, for partners. That'd be really interesting.
Jeff?
You mentioned briefly the idea of flows and flexible consumption models, how they could enable a company potentially to move from selling discrete units, if you will, to something that would be more along the lines of a subscription service. As you both know, this is a big area for technology companies, especially right now. And my question is, thinking about this in terms of flows, how could flows enable a company to move their business model or their operating model to something that's more consumption-based?
Well, it's a great question, and I did provide one example of that is in printing as a service. You know, the flows that we're talking about there are information that's coming from the equipment itself to the home office that's being acted on. There are, due to technology and due to connectivity, we can, almost any machine can, phone home. And so you can use the constant monitoring of your assets in a way that can enable delivering it more towards a service model. Does that answer your question?
You know, it's kind of like one of our fire starters, linked, right? Or linked. And so the whole idea of manufacturing changes, and the flow of information from the machine, which can be very remote to you, and from your designer or from yourself. You push a button, and then it gets made in Minneapolis and then sent back to you by FedEx, and there you have it. That's
Right.
wildly, that's like your printing example, but it's for all manufacturing, right?
Right. And then if you move towards 3D, and we talk about, and I think there's some fire starters on this too, around CAD design for 3D printing. We're going to have global networks of engineering,
Yeah.
and the flows of information are going to be really astounding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Murray.
Yeah. After this, I'm hesitant to actually, after that introduction, to actually ask a question.
Oh.
Actually, I want to share an idea
Wonderful.
about the enterprise and flow and interaction and how things are different. That is that because of the amount of interaction and the ability to understand and predict the future of the enterprise is much more limited. And you have to be much more reactive to what's going on. So the management style of the enterprise really has to be changed. And we've seen this over the last few years, but I recently had a client who still was following a 5-year plan. And they were nowhere, the reality of assumptions behind their 5-year plan had nothing to do with the reality they were living in. Things had changed considerably, but they were still following the same 5-year plan. And the point is, we're going to need tighter control loops, much more agile management, because of the amount of interaction we're having at the enterprise.
That was actually brought up last year by John Hagel. He was talking about the human factor and how change is going to be really difficult for people who have been in business for a long time, for them to understand flow and interaction. So that's, I get where he's
Yeah.
coming from.
I mean, you see, when people go to meetings, everyone hates meetings. And there's often somebody who will block everything, It's like one guy or one woman, and the flow thing just goes like that. The meeting grounds to a halt, and then everyone just goes home mad.
Right. And if you think about an enterprise where you have to have at least, there may be that one powerful voice, but even if you've got some level of balance, you've got to have a consensus to move forward. And that takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of discussion, a lot of education. And those are the reasons why we're not as nimble as we need to be. And oftentimes people say, gee, we're in a world of exponential technologies. Why aren't we seeing some of these things happen more quickly? And it's that element. It's that element that, transformation, especially in groups, in large groups, and in the enterprise. And it came up earlier today in the construct of publicly traded companies that are reporting their results on 90-day increments, and they've got constant pressure to think through that cycle, and to really fundamentally transform and move towards an entirely different business model. When you're under that type of pressure, and you've got activist investors out there, it's
A lot of
it's a
interaction,
daunting
little flow.
challenge. A lot of interaction and little flow. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is John Hines. I think it's implied with what you're describing, but I wanted to make it more explicit, at least in my own mind, that flow and interaction are always present, but they're not always visible. And creating the visualizations that uncover what is flowing or not, and what interactions are positive and which ones are negative, is, I think, really crucial in order for this to be uncovered and to break through the barriers to seeing and adopting and sharing this.
Yeah, I think you're right. We I don't know if are we going to announce our next book?
Yeah, we can do that.
So we're going to do another book. And if you're already an author in this book, we'll ask you if you'd like to take your transcript and convert it into a written chapter for the next version of this, which will be yet more thoughtful. And anyone who wants to pile on and be part of that book, in addition, whether or not you were in this one, let us know. We'll certainly consider it. We definitely want to create Bible number 2
Right.
for next year
Right.
and have it really be a written book that
And we
addresses
hope
the
that
same.
it can be shared with even more people, and people really understand it can be written in a way that
Yes.
the general public could read it and really get something out of it
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
So, Ben?
So, Mark, you think you know that I think biology is exactly this. It's flows and interactions. And so the future of medicine is going to have to be personal flows of data that we're making educational medical decisions on. But something that's really slow to do change is the government. So I'm sort of curious how you see the interaction of policy changing to accommodate this increasing personal flow.
You said Mark.
Anyone can
Did you
answer.
want
Sorry,
Paul?
I didn't mean to single you out.
Paul?
It's a great question. I think this, we talked about the challenges of groups and getting alignment towards taking a decision and moving forward. And I think probably the biggest challenge that we have, but also a really significant opportunity, is the regulatory bodies, because they're not really usually accountable for achieving a specific measurable outcome within a specific time frame. And so that creates real challenges in trying to get to a point where a decision is taken. But at the same time, they can be a great enabler. So a collaboration with the regulatory bodies is really essential, because they can be a no-sayer and shut down, or when they're educated and they understand the possibilities for whichever constituencies they represent, they can be very empowering, and they can unleash a lot of support in terms of incentives and an opportunity to accelerate. So the biggest challenge is that they're not held accountable to specific and measurable outcomes within a time frame. So,
Listening to you describe that, and I'm not in any way qualified to address this question, but if the elected representatives were paid to achieve, like in the olden days, as my son used to say, where the only reward they get is by going back to their constituents and reporting out, right? Doing what they're getting paid to get something done. Then something will get done. If they're getting paid to block legislation by K Street lobbyists, then they will. I feel like that's more like today. And so I think your point about reward, not just measuring it, but actually who's rewarding whom for what? And if you make more money blocking than you make by doing or by passing legislation, that's going to lead to a very interactive situation compared to a negatively interactive situation compared to the old days.
yeah, and is it a situation where some of these issues are so complex that reaching a consensus when you're not under a time constraint to force a decision
Right.
becomes an opportunity to endlessly debate,
Yeah.
and then you fail to act.
Right.
Right.
Anyone else?
I think we're.
I think we're done.
Perfect,
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Denise.
Thank you.